Von Sanktionen zu Kriegsrecht und
From sanctions to martial law and a state of emergency, extralegal political persecution and the West's war against Russia, the political science perspective. Against the current, straight to the point.
Sanktionen sind ein Herrschaftsinstrument.
Sanctions are an instrument of domination used to enforce economic interests, political power, and cultural hegemony. They can affect international relations, economic relations, criminal law, the labor market, or everyday violations of rules. But today, they are not being used to uphold democratic values and stop human rights violations. Rather, they are a weapon for securing the neo-imperialist dominance of the West and its leading power, the United States.
Und seiner Führungsmacht USA dar. Sie dienen nicht nur dazu, jenseits direkter Militär.
They serve not only to force states into submission beyond the use of direct military violence, but also to eliminate domestic political opposition through extralegal arbitrary measures and to compel anticipatory obedience throughout the population by creating fear. I want to explain this using 4 examples. First, the measures against German journalist Hüseyin Doğru, as an example of the transition to anti-democratic rule. Second, the sanctions against retired Swiss Colonel Jacques Bode, as an example of the supranational nature of sanctions.
Für den supranationalen Charakter der Sanktionen. Drittens, das Beispiel der Kubanerin Ana Perez.
Third, the example of the Cuban woman Ana Perez shows how sanctions, as an imperial, neo-colonial instrument of oppression, affect an individual. And fourth, the Magnitsky Act as a weapon to destabilize Russia in the struggle to preserve U.S. hegemony. I will show that sanctions are an instrument of domination, deployed by the United States and implemented independently by its European vassals. This demonstrates, in a particularly striking way, submission to the leading power at the cost of destroying one's own economy, democracy, and rule of law.
Wirtschaft, der Demokratie und des Rechtsstaats. Ziel ist es, die Vasallen stärker auszubeuten.
The goal is to exploit the vassals more heavily and make the war against Russia permanent. Example 1. Hüseyin Doğru, the transition to anti-democratic rule. Journalist Hüseyin Doğru is a German citizen and was born in Germany. On May 20th, 2025, he was sanctioned by the Council of the European Union. The justification given was that he was spreading Russian disinformation. Doğru disputes this. There was no court ruling. A foreign policy instrument of power is being used domestically against a citizen without a legal criminal provision, without a ruling under the rule of law, and without the person concerned being heard.
Rechtsstaatliches Urteil ohne Anhörung des Betroffenen. Dies bedeutet eine neue Form der Willkür.
This represents a new form of arbitrary rule. Doğru's bank accounts were frozen, his financial transactions restricted, and his access to money reduced to a monthly allowance of 506 euros. Often, his bank blocked even that amount. The accounts of Doğru's wife and mother were also temporarily frozen. Doğru and his wife have 3 children, 2 newborns, and a 7-year-old son. The well-being of these children is at risk because he can no longer provide for them. The European Union relies on Article 215 of the Treaty on the Functioning of the European Union when imposing sanctions.
Des Vertrags über die Arbeitsweise der Europäischen Union. Nach Absatz 2 kann der EU-Rat auf gemeinsame...
Under paragraph 2, the EU Council may adopt restrictive measures against individuals or legal entities, as well as groups or non-state entities, acting on a joint proposal by the Union's High Representative for Foreign Affairs and Security Policy and the Commission. At the second level, the sanctions are based on Regulation 2024-2642. The core element is financial sanctions under Article 2, paragraph 1. All funds and economic resources owned, possessed, held, or controlled by the individuals, legal entities, organizations, or bodies listed in Annex 1 are frozen. In January 2026, the German Bundestag transposed and tightened EU Directive 2024/26 into national law.
Nationales Recht umgesetzt und verschärft. Zugestimmt haben die Regierungsparteien CDU, CSU und
The governing parties, the CDU, CSU, and SPD voted in favor, Alliance 90, the Greens and the Left Party abstained. The AfD voted against it. One of the most serious changes is that numerous violations are being upgraded from administrative offenses to criminal offenses. This affects certain transaction bans, payment bans, and acts of circumvention. It also affects violations of the so-called duty of every person, which requires everyone to report possible sanctions violations to the authorities. In this way, extralegal sanctions and criminal law are being intertwined in a perfidious manner. De facto, Doru is thus deprived of all rights. This violates human dignity, Article 1 of the Basic Law, and suspends the Basic Law in its fundamental rights. Anyone who helps him is committing a criminal offense. His wife's and mother's accounts were frozen because their son was considered to exercise control over the funds. The administrative court in Cologne has since lifted the freeze on his wife's account, citing serious doubts about the legality of the measures imposed by the Central Office for Sanctions Enforcement. The accusations against Hüseyin Doğru are implausible for the simple reason that Doğru is critical of Russia and has condemned the Russian invasion of Ukraine as an invasion. Freezing the accounts of relatives amounts to reintroducing the Nazi practice of collective family punishment. The punishment is imposed not on the basis of proof of individual guilt, but according to the logic of guilt by association. Legal scholar Ninon Kolnarik, who served for many years as a judge at the European Court of Justice, and her colleague Alina Miron of the University of Angers in France, conclude in a legal opinion that based on the provisions on freedom of expression in the UN Covenant on Civil and Political Rights, the analysis provides evidence that Council Decision 2025-9963 and Regulation 2025-964 are incompatible with the protection of human rights. This refers to the declarations and publications of the 17th Sanctions Package, which turned Doğru and others into non-persons. They violate Article 11 of the Charter of Fundamental Rights of the European Union, adopted in December 2000, which guarantees freedom of expression and freedom of information. They also violate Article 45 of the Charter, which guarantees EU citizens freedom of movement, as well as Articles 15 and 17, which establish the right to property and the freedom to choose an occupation. All of these measures are illegal, incompatible with the rule of law, and unconstitutional. The European legal response to such situations, according to Axel Fersen of the SPD Council of Elders, has been established for almost 2 decades. It is called the Cadi Doctrine. The Court of Justice of the European Union ruled in case C4025P Cadi was, and in the subsequent decision C58410P Cadi 2, that even sanctions motivated by security policy must respect the rights of the defense, the right to be heard, effective judicial protection, and property rights. The Council must prove that its reasons are well-founded. The person concerned does not have to prove their innocence. A general, vague statement of reasons is not enough. And even where confidential information is involved, judicial review must not be stripped of substance. If the EU institution cannot provide that proof, the listing cannot stand. That is how simple and unambiguous the Union's own case law is regarding its own instrument. A union that does not apply this doctrine in its own house, but instead circumvents it, deprives itself of its credibility as a community based on the rule of law. An overwhelmingly large coalition in the Bundestag supports these anti-democratic and illegal sanctions. Only AfD lawmakers voted against implementing them in national law. The active support of the CDU, CSU, and SPD, and the abstention of B90, the Greens, and the Left show that the anti-democratic forces are not in the AfD, but in the ruling party cartel. This documents a new extremism of the center, an involution of parliamentary democracy into a new form of authoritarian rule, while the AfD and BSW oppose the hollowing out of parliamentarianism. This shows the transformation of democracy into a new, anti-democratic and autocratic form of rule.
Das herrschende Parteienkartell bemüht sich also die Einführung einer Diktatur.
The ruling party cartel is therefore working to introduce a dictatorship on velvet paws. This is a permanent coup d'etat. In this seizure of power by the ruling party cartel, and in the transformation of parliamentary democracy into a state of intimidation, more than 330 government-funded non-governmental organizations are helping by publicly defaming so-called disinformation actors. They are the transmission belts of authoritarian rule, because they bring about a structural transformation of the public sphere into one of censorship and denunciation, thereby destroying the space for democratic debate. Together with the extralegal sanctions, they serve to create fear in order to force the population into anticipatory obedience and hollow out democratic procedures.
Und demokratische Verfahren zu entkernen. Beispiel 2. Jacques Baab, die NATO.
Example 2. Jacques Baab. NATO is pulling the strings behind the scenes. Jacques Baab is a Swiss military analyst, a former colonel in Swiss military intelligence, a former employee of the United Nations and NATO, and the author of numerous books. In those books, he relies exclusively on Western sources, yet he clearly diverges from NATO and EU propaganda. He too is accused of spreading Russian disinformation. Like Hussein Dogru, Jacques Baab has also been stripped of all his rights. He no longer has access to his accounts in the EU. He is no longer allowed to travel and therefore cannot return to his home country. No one is allowed to support him. That would be a violation of sanctions. Even his Swiss bank, UBS, temporarily froze his account completely.
Hat zeitweise sein Konto vollständig gesperrt. Nach massiven öffentlichen Protesten kann nun wenigstens
After massive public protests, at least his pension can now be paid out again, and his health insurance payments can be debited again. Jacques Baab has received a great deal of solidarity from the people of Brussels. Passers-by encourage him on the street. Neighbors and local residents cook for him, shop for him, and give him food and money. The Swiss Freedom Bell ringers brought him food from his homeland and demonstrated in front of the Swiss embassy in Brussels. After all this time, Switzerland lodged a half-hearted protest with the EU, but took no further action.
Hat aber keine weiterführenden Maßnahmen ergriffen. Weder wurde der Vertreter der EU in Bern einbestellt, noch
Neither was the EU representative in Bern summoned, nor was Jacques Baab issued a diplomatic passport in order to grant him diplomatic immunity and give him legal protection. A senior embassy official told the Freiheitsstrickler, "We can't exactly issue a diplomatic passport to every broke tourist in Thailand either." That suggests that a former Swiss officer who served his country in war zones and crisis areas should be equated with a sex tourist. That shows the attitude. Despite growing public protests, Switzerland is joining in with the sanctions and thereby submitting to directives from Brussels. Swiss neutrality now largely exists only on paper and has become worthless in practice.
Und ist in der Praxis wertlos geworden. Jacques Baab bestreitet die Vorwürfe.
Jacques Baab denies the allegations. He points out that his analyses rely solely on Western sources, not Russian ones. He suspects that the sanctions against him were imposed at the initiative of the French government. First, Paris had to have its turn at some point. Second, his publisher, Max Milo, is based in Paris. His lawyer's strategy is not to challenge the sanctions in principle, but to have their client removed from the sanctions list. The Berlin law firm Hummel Legal concludes that in imposing sanctions on Jacques Baab and others, the EU Council is exceeding its authority because it is intervening in internal societal debates. The accusation of supporting Russian narratives is a catch-all charge. It violates the rule of law principle of legal certainty and allows for arbitrary application. The decision violates freedom of expression under Article 10 of the European Convention on Human Rights, freedom of the press under Article 11 of the EU Charter of Fundamental Rights, the freedom to choose an occupation under Article 15 of the Charter, the fundamental right to freedom of movement under Article 45 of the EU Charter of Fundamental Rights, the agreement on the free movement of persons with Switzerland, the fundamental right to property under Article 17 of the Charter, and the right to a fair trial under Article 47 of the Charter, and Article 6 of the European Convention on Human Rights. The Council disregarded the case law of the European Court of Justice and ignored fundamental procedural principles of the rule of law. The result, the sanctions decision of December 15, 2025, against Jacques Baab violates basic principles of the rule of law and infringes on his fundamental rights. The sanctions decision against Jacques Baab must be annulled. This orgy of repression against opponents of the war and the government was initiated by NATO. At its 2023 summit in Vilnius, the governments of the member states announced that they would step up cooperation with the EU in combating so-called disinformation. This suggests that NATO is pulling the strings behind the scenes in the fight against dissenting opinions. With its strategic agenda for 2024 to 2029, announced in June 2024, the EU shifted onto a course of preparing for war. In it, the European Council promises to strengthen the EU's resilience through an approach that covers all threats and society as a whole. The EU treats everything it considers disinformation as an attempt at destabilization, placing it in the same category as terrorism and violent extremism. Norbert Herring rightly concludes that, in doing so, the EU is effectively declaring critics of governments and NATO to be enemies of the state. This means that undeclared martial law already prevails in the EU.
Damit herrscht in der EU bereits ein nicht erklärtes Kriegsrecht. Das bedeutet, die NATO regiert im Hintergrund mit.
That means NATO is also governing behind the scenes, and the usual rule of law guarantees in peacetime, such as freedom of opinion and freedom of information, no longer apply when issues important to NATO are involved. Last year, the German government declared that it was bound by secret NATO objectives. Investigations show that the governments of NATO countries use all social organizations and forces as transmission belts to subject people who are guided by the peace requirement in Germany's basic law to repression. The EU is thus presenting itself as a supranational, lawless, and anti-democratic space. In coordination with NATO, it imposes measures designed to circumvent the rule of law. That makes these extralegal sanctions part of the law of war.
Damit sind die extralegalen Sanktionen Teil des Kriegsrechts. Sie greifen der vollständigen Verhängung des Kriegsrechts vor.
They anticipate the full imposition of martial law. They are meant to destroy the very existence of political dissidents and force the EU population into preemptive obedience by creating fear. In doing so, they are preparing not only for a state of readiness for war against Russia, but for the imposition of a state of emergency. Example 3. Anna Perez. An attack on health and killing through sanctions. You do not know Miss Anna Perez. She plays no role in the political debate. No one gives her a hearing. She is one of the millions of victims of US and EU sanctions policy. Her trail disappears somewhere between Havana and French Guiana. In 2012, I received a call from a family I knew in Santiago de Cuba.
Befreundeten Familie aus Santiago de Cuba erhalten. Der Tochter Anna gehe es schlecht, sie habe nur noch 3 Zähne und
their daughter Anna was doing badly. She had only 3 teeth left and could no longer chew. There was no money for dental restoration because the clinic had to be paid to procure the materials if they were available at all. I promised to help. My own dentist advised me against it. The cost of a complete restoration would be very high. You need an artificial tooth root made of titanium or ceramic inserted into the jawbone, then an artificial base for the replacement tooth. Third, a screw also made of titanium as a prosthetic component for fixation. He said he would give me the necessary parts which would reduce the cost. After that, I wanted to discuss it with a treating dentist in Havana.
Dies mit der behandelnden Zahnärztin in Havanna besprechen. Sie sagte zu meiner Überraschung, Sie brauchen mir keine.
To my surprise, she said, "You don't need to bring me any spare parts. The materials you mentioned are sanctioned by the United States and can't be imported. But we have another way of making dental implants. We make them out of ivory." That left me speechless because the ivory trade is heavily restricted internationally and largely prohibited. So how does the ivory get to Cuba? Then it suddenly dawned on me. Cubans fought in Angola from 1975 to 1991. That deployment helped bring about the end of South African apartheid and Namibia's independence. Exporting ivory for medical purposes is strictly prohibited. But old trade connections dating back to the independence wars apparently make a covert ivory trade possible.
Handel mit Elfenbein möglich machen. Als Antwort auf die kubanische Revolution und die Enteignung.
In response to the Cuban Revolution and the expropriation of U.S. companies, the United States imposed sanctions on Cuba in 1960. These include a comprehensive embargo. Almost all economic transactions between U.S. citizens and businesses are prohibited. The de facto oil blockade has led to severe shortages and power outages. Cuba is designated a state sponsor of terrorism. As a result, travelers to Cuba can no longer easily travel to the United States using ESTA. Financial restrictions have led institutions such as Visa and MasterCard to temporarily suspend payments in Cuba. The sanctions have pushed Cuba's healthcare system to the brink of collapse. The medical system, once considered exemplary, is therefore suffering from a humanitarian crisis.
Deshalb unter einer humanitären Krise. In der Praxis blockieren die extraterritorialen Finanzrechte.
In practice, extraterritorial financial restrictions, logistical obstacles, and fuel shortages are blocking medical care. Even basic antibiotics, painkillers like aspirin, and anesthetics are missing from hospitals. Newborn care can now operate only under severe limitations. According to the UN High Commissioner for Human Rights, child mortality has doubled to 9.9 per 1,000 births. The survival rate for children with cancer fell from 85% to 65%. That means sanctions kill. According to a study by Francisco Rodriguez and colleagues published in the medical journal The Lancet, sanctions imposed by the United States and the European Union were responsible for 564,258 deaths each year from 1971 to 2021.
Von 1971 bis 2021 jährlich für 564.258 Todesfälle verantwortlich. Diese Zahl ist deutlich höher als die jährliche Zahl der.
This figure is significantly higher than the annual number of direct war casualties, 106,000 deaths. So over the period mentioned, the total comes to more than 28 million deaths. Sanctions are restrictive foreign policy tools. They are often applied to broad economic transactions, with the aim of forcing a change in behavior through punitive measures. According to the Global Sanctions Database, both the frequency and duration of sanctions have steadily increased since 1950, while their success rate in achieving their stated objective has remained at around 30%. All economic sanctions act as sanctions against human health. They restrict access to medical products and health services, harm mental health, and undermine the human right to health.
Und unterminieren das Menschenrecht auf Gesundheit. Ein Viertel aller Länder wurden von 2010.
1/4 of all countries were targeted by sanctions between 2010 and 2022. Most of them in Africa. These usually involve freezing foreign assets, trade embargoes, or financial restrictions. Their aim is to destabilize countries that refuse to submit to the West's rules of the game. Unless, as was partly the case with sanctions against apartheid South Africa, they are imposed with the approval of the United Nations, they are all illegal. So sanctions are not a tool for enforcing human rights or democracy. Their purpose is blackmail, popular revolt, and regime change.
Revolte der Bevölkerung und Regimewechsel. Sie sind ein neokoloniales Machtinstrument des Westens.
They are a neo-colonial instrument of power for the West and its leading power, the United States. They are part of its strategy to subjugate other countries. The talk of human rights is hollow propaganda meant to obscure political and economic interests. Especially since the end of the Cold War, the United States has tried to use sanctions to enforce its interests. At the same time, economic sanctions trigger strategies to evade them. Where they push target countries to the brink of economic collapse, as in the case of Cuba, they plunge those states into political instability and civil wars. Cuba's government is currently preparing for a prolonged guerrilla war in the event of a U.S. invasion.
Im Falle eines US-Einmarsches vor. Beispiel 4. Magnitsky Act.
Example 4. The Magnitsky Act, propaganda lies, and the sanctions war against Russia. Filmmaker Andrei Nekrasov went through a nightmare with his 2016 hybrid of feature film and documentary, The Magnitsky Act, Behind the Scenes. Massive criticism from the propaganda press and political backlash. Nekrasov's interest was sparked by media reports about the 36-year-old lawyer Sergei Magnitsky. According to those reports, Magnitsky had been arrested, tortured, and killed by Russian authorities because he had uncovered a $230 million tax fraud scheme. That was the story told by American hedge fund manager William Browder. Browder became the largest foreign investor in Russia. Until he was expelled in 2005, his fund had grown to $4 billion.
Schwoll sein Fonds auf 4 Milliarden US-Dollar an. Nekrasov ist von Browders Geschichte begeistert.
Nekrasov is fascinated by Browder's story. His film is funded by public broadcasting as well as Norwegian and Finnish sources. But as he investigates, the story of corruption and state terrorism begins to crack. Inconsistencies emerge, leaving Nekrasov and his editor puzzled in the editing room. More and more, Magnitsky no longer appears to be a young, gifted whistleblower, but rather an ordinary accountant in William Browder's financial empire. Browder, who portrays himself as Putin's #1 enemy and a fighter for human rights, gets tangled up in half-truths and cover-ups.
Verheddert sich in Halbwahrheiten und Verschleierungen. Am Ende kommt Nekrasov sogar als Putin-Kritiker zu dem Ergebnis.
In the end, even Nekrasov, a critic of Putin, concludes that Browder lied and invented his story to conceal his own illegal financial dealings, that Magnitsky was an accomplice in the cover-up, that there were documented grounds for suspicion behind his arrest, and that he died in prison for health reasons and because of medical negligence, not because he was tortured. In reality, Magnitsky was not a lawyer, but an accountant, an auditor at a law firm that Browder had used for many years. In Magnitsky's original handwritten statement to the police, no one is named as having stolen the alleged $230 million in missing tax payments.
$230 Millionen an Steuerzahlungen gestohlen zu haben. Nekrasovs endgültiges Urteil lautet, dass Browder kein
Nekrasov's final judgment is that Browder is not a man of integrity in business, but the shrewd operator of a complex network of shell companies with ties to Russian gangsters, and he concludes that Magnitsky must have known about it. Nekrasov also suggests that Browder exploited Magnitsky's death to divert attention from his own shady dealings. Browder used Russian frontmen, among other things, to acquire shares in Gazprom, which could not be sold to foreigners, in order to protect valuable companies. When Browder realizes that Nekrasov is not reaching the desired conclusion, he ends the interview and warns the director that he'd better not pursue it.
Den Regisseur, solle besser nicht darauf eingehen. Der Film wurde aus der Vermarktung weitgehend verbannt.
The film was largely shut out of the marketplace, not through open censorship, but through a propaganda campaign and legal threats from financier William Browder and his associates. It was about controlling public opinion. Browder managed to push the Magnitsky Act through Congress. You have to know that, because of his business deals and use of tax loopholes, the financier gave up his U.S. citizenship in 1998 and became a British citizen. And after being charged with tax evasion involving $40 billion, he had to leave Russia in 2003. In 2005, his visa was declared invalid. In July 2016, the Russian authorities provided the U.S. Department of Justice with comprehensive information about the allegations against Browder and submitted an 1,100-page investigative file.
Von 1100 Seiten übermittelt. Im August wurden zusätzliche Informationen weitergegeben.
In August, additional information was provided. The Russian prosecutor general asked 9 times about the progress of the investigation in the United States. The U.S. Justice Department showed no interest in investigating violations of its own tax laws. Meanwhile, Browder used his demonstrably false statements and his illegally obtained profits, which had been funneled into the United States through offshore companies, to pay for his lobbying for the Magnitsky Act and to provide financial support for the election campaigns of Democratic Party politicians. According to Russian prosecutors, William Browder was handled as an agent by the British intelligence service MI6 throughout his entire stay in Russia under the code name Solomon.
Als Agent unter dem Decknamen Solomon geführt. Auf Nachfrage dementiert ein geheimdienstlicher Mitarbeiter.
When asked, he denies being an intelligence operative. But the eager support for Browder and his possible intelligence ties show that Browder's activities were part of a planned political campaign. It was driven by powerful financial interests and deep state forces that had benefited from the plundering of Russia in the 1990s. In the West, the case became a kind of symbol of the Russian state's criminal practices. In the United States, it led to the passage of the Magnitsky Act, which imposed sanctions on Russian officials. The Sergei Magnitsky Rule of Law Accountability Act was passed by the U.S. Congress in 2012 as bipartisan legislation and signed by President Obama at the time.
Und vom damaligen Präsidenten Obama unterzeichnet. 2017 folgte the Global Magnitsky Act.
In 2017, the Global Magnitsky Act followed, authorizing the United States to impose sanctions worldwide for human rights violations. In 2019, the European Parliament adopted a corresponding resolution calling on all member states to pass laws similar to those in the United States. In effect, this is about imposing sanctions on Russia under false pretenses, or about lies as part of the economic war against Russia. This, in turn, shows that such sanctions are purely arbitrary measures. The Magnitsky Act is only one example among the many sanctions imposed by the United States and the EU against Russia.
Sanktionen der USA und der EU gegen Russland. Das Konzept ist theoretisch formuliert im Papier der Rand Corporation.
The concept is set out theoretically in the Rand Corporation paper, Overextending and Unbalancing Russia. The report examines how a range of measures, encouraging domestic protests, supplying weapons to Ukraine, and damaging Russia's reputation, could weaken and destabilize Russia. Rand states that measures designed to impose economic costs would have a particularly high likelihood of success. These include trade and financial sanctions, which would need to be broad and multilateral. It goes on to say that military aid to Ukraine would provoke a war between Russia and Ukraine, and that this would be a very long and costly war for Russia, one that Ukraine would almost certainly lose.
Den die Ukraine fast mit Sicherheit verlieren würde. Die Zerstörung der Ukraine war also eingepreist,
The destruction of Ukraine was thus factored in order to weaken Russia in every conceivable way. But the sanctions are missing their target and turning out to be a boomerang. Italy's Deputy Minister of Economic Development, Michele Geraci, has explained why the sanctions against Russia are failing to achieve their goal. First, they are based on wishful thinking. Their effectiveness was never assessed. Second, the sanctions bounce off the resilience of a country that is self-sufficient in energy and resources. Third, the share of gas exports to the European Union was massively overestimated. They account for only 2.2% of gross domestic product, not the assumed 25 to 30%. Fourth, Russia's resilience as a nation was underestimated.
Russlands Widerstandskraft als Nation wurde unterschätzt. Die Menschen rebellieren nicht gegen Putin,
The people are not rebelling against Putin. They are rallying behind his policies. Fifth, the ability of the Russian government and the Russian central bank to counter the sanctions pressure that has existed since 2014 with fiscal and monetary measures was underestimated. Sixth, there were illusions about the strategy of isolating Russia internationally. Only 40 out of 193 countries joined the sanctions regime. The other 153 continue to trade with Russia. The European Union and especially the German federal government have thus sent the economy into a recessionary spiral. Those responsible see only two ways out: investment in the military-industrial complex and the political persecution of government critics.
Die politische Verfolgung von Regierungskritikern. Fazit.
In conclusion, the sanctions imposed by the EU Council and individual states violate the law and the Constitution. The EU is using its sanctions list as a weapon against critics and is maneuvering itself ever deeper into an abyss of lawlessness. Sanctions policy undermines the core elements of fundamental rights. It operates without charges, without a court order, without a hearing, without a defense. The EU is disregarding the European Convention on Human Rights and European case law. These sanctions are measures imposed by a supranational organization with no democratic legitimacy, or unilateral measures by a hegemonic power that have not been approved by the United Nations. The EU Council is made up of the executive bodies, that is, the government representatives of the member states, who were not elected by their parliaments to exercise legislative functions at the supranational level. This blatant democratic deficit is being used to undermine the rule of law order of the member states. The sanctions are part of a new kind of martial law that establishes a legal system without judicial review and gives authorities power without judicial proceedings. This new martial law can be seen as part of the preparations for war. Apparently, the aim is to create a habituation effect to new forms of arbitrary rule, which would then make it easier to declare a state of tension. In a state of tension, we will all become Hussein Doğru and Jacques Bode.
Dann werden das Recht auf Freizügigkeit nach Artikel 11,
then the right to freedom of movement under Article 11 of the Basic Law, the privacy of correspondence, mail and telecommunications under Article 10, the right to the inviolability of the home under Article 13, property rights under Article 14, the freedom to choose one's occupation under Article 12, and the right to the free development of one's personality under Article 2 of the Basic Law are restricted. The EU and NATO have long been in a war against Russia, albeit a covert one. The economic war is being waged not only through numerous sanctions packages, but through open acts of piracy. Hundreds of billions are being pumped into the arms industry. Both are leading to the impoverishment and deindustrialization of Western European societies. Any potential protests are met with the full force of the police.
Mit dem Digital Services Act aus 2022,
with the Digital Services Act of 2022, it became possible to implement across the EU the model that had already existed in Germany under the Network Enforcement Act. The aim is to assert control over the discourse on geopolitical issues through the fight against so-called disinformation and through open censorship. So-called disinformation is classified as a threat to internal security, regardless of whether it is directed or encouraged from abroad. It is governments themselves that decide what constitutes disinformation. This opens the door wide to anti-democratic arbitrariness. The EU's crackdown on critical journalists goes back to a NATO summit decision in 2023. The sanctions are orchestrated by NATO as part of its fight against disinformation and implemented by an EU that has mutated from a peace project into the war machine of the Western alliance. They are an attempt to preserve the dominance of Western elites under U.S. leadership and to stop the decline of the West. Sanctions demonstrate the destruction of international law by the West and the United States and the return of the law of the fist in international relations. In addition, Western sanctions are responsible for hundreds of thousands of deaths. They are an instrument of murder, not a contribution to promoting democracy. The sanctions against Russia are intended to bring Russia to its knees economically. The foreign minister at the time, Annalena Baerbock, said, This will ruin Russia.
Außenministerin Annalena Baerbock, das wird Russland ruinieren. Die Sanktionen würden beibehalten, egal was meine
The sanctions would remain in place, regardless of what my voters think. The RAND Corporation has defined the goal of destabilizing Russia. Years ago, Zbigniew Brzezinski, the leading U.S. foreign policy thinker, formulated the goal of stripping Russia of its great power status by breaking Ukraine away from it. Domestically, a permanent coup is intended to secure the rule of transatlantic elites by hollowing out democratic procedures while maintaining the democratic facade. So this is the introduction of a dictatorship on velvet paws. Its claws remain invisible to the majority, but are all the more effective. As Giorgio Agamben puts it, the state of emergency is turning into a permanent practice of governing.
Giorgio Agamben in eine ständige Praxis des Regierens. Es geht also einen direkten Angriff.
This is therefore a direct attack on the democracy of the member states. In Germany, it is an attack on the basic law's commitment to peace and on fundamental, inalienable civil and human rights. These measures are unlawful, unconstitutional, anti-democratic, and serve to prepare for war. Anyone who supports them is violating the Charter of the United Nations, Article 26 of the Basic Law, and Section 80 of the Criminal Code, which prohibits preparing a war of aggression. That is why the political forces in the German Bundestag that support the sanctions policy must be removed from office. Through its sanctions policy, the federal government and the parties that support it are attempting to abolish the constitutional order. Under Article 20 of the Basic Law, all Germans have the right to resist when no other remedy is possible.
Zum Widerstand, wenn andere Abhilfe nicht möglich ist.